Okay, in the last tutorial, we created this scene in order to learn how to use physical camera settings and in Redshift and get things looking pretty great. So step one, we're going to make some materials so we get some really good gloss, and we're going to create some lighting quickly so that we have interesting reflections on the object, so we can really see what we're doing and what the changes that we're making impact and how they impact that. So let's start with the light. We are going to click on our area light. We're going to come down here and we're going to make a dome light, which, right, it's a big sphere around the space like a dome. And with this dome light, we are going to be using this texture field to put an HDRI in there, because that's going to give us really great lighting and reflections on our objects. And so to grab an HDR image, what we need to do is we need to go up to Window, go to our asset browser. You can also hit Shift F8. And I'm just going to type in HDRI. And I'm going to wait a second. And here we go. Right? So I've got a bunch of these different HDRI images. You can choose whichever one you want. I would prefer you to do something that's, outdoors. I'm going to go with this sandy scene here. And so what I can do, we've done this before in other tutorials, I just click and drag this down, drop it in that texture field on my dome light, and it's going to take a second to download because things are moving slow right now. Like really, really slow. Okay, so I've got something going on in the background now. Fantastic. That's all right. All we're using this for really is just to see color. Like, we don't really care if this is actually visible. There's this background checkbox here. If I uncheck that, it'll hide it, but it'll still be used for lighting, for calculating lighting, and it'll be used for reflections and all of that as well. Okay, so we've done that. Let's go ahead and create a material. And if you haven't done so already, make sure that you are in Redshift. So you're going to want to click on your edit render settings and make sure the renderer at the top is set to Redshift. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and hit plus, create a standard material. I am going to make one change to this material right now, which is just to set my roughness down to somewhere around around 1/100th of a unit. And then I'm going to go ahead and just apply this to, instead of trying to apply this to all the different individual elements, I can just apply these to the cloners. So I can drop this right there onto that cloner, and I can go ahead and drop this onto my sphere cloner. And then for the landscape, let's go ahead and create another material, and we'll go ahead and make this material much flatter. So I've got a second material. Let's go ahead and drop the weight of that channel down. We'll crank the diffuse roughness up. And maybe let's go ahead and make this, like, I don't know, sandy colored or something like that. It doesn't really matter to me what color you make it. You can make it magenta and I'd be happy. Okay, So we're going to go ahead and use this as our landscape color, which kind of matches the soil color here. Doesn't really matter. Now that we've done that, if you followed other tutorials, I've made my own little Redshift tab where I have the Redshift render view here. If you are coming into this fresh, you can go to the Redshift menu at the top and go down to Redshift render view. You can also, if I switch back here, you can also go click here and you should have RS render view available as well. It'll be a free floating window and you can just snap it in wherever, or leave it free floating if you have multiple monitors, which is great. Okay, once this is open, I'm going to go ahead and just click Start Stop on IPR. And once it processes the textures and builds the shaders, it should actually render my scene. Okay, right, so I've got good lighting, I've got good reflections, and I've got a lot of objects in the scene. It's fantastic. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we need the part that's going to be most important going forward for our scene is a camera. And we're just going to use the standard Redshift camera. So I've created the camera, and when I do that, I want you to note that in the window here, you can see this orange frame has appeared. Basically, right, we talked about this earlier, but the camera is going to have this orange frame. It's going to be set exactly as the camera was, the default camera was, in whatever position it was when it was created. Now, we do want to make sure that we are inside, that we are looking through this camera by clicking on this little box here and making sure it's white with a dot in it. Now we are using the correct camera. I am going to pull this scene view a little bit smaller and then pull this over so we can actually see our attributes. And so the you may be starting in the Object tab. We're not going to worry about any of these settings right now. We're going to leave all of this set to the default for the time being. Actually, that's not true. We're going to make one change. We're going to adjust the focal length, right? Let's say that these are marbles. They're tiny. Granted, the scale looks weird because of the background, which we could hide. But these are marbles, and so let's say we want to be using like a telephoto style lens to zoom in on these objects. So I'm going to go ahead and telephoto lenses. You can see there's all these different settings. If I come down here, you can see there's not really that many. There's fisheye and spherical and all of that. But if I come over here to my focal length and increase this, you'll see it basically zooms in on a certain area, right? And a telephoto lens usually has, a zoom. A focal length like this might be decent. It's somewhere in the range of like a zoom lens. We could look online. But right, we're just zooming in on a really small part of the scene. But what I want to do is I'm going to rotate my camera some now. And this is going to be moving the camera that we've currently have active, because I want to have kind of a low angle. And let's see here if I can get... Right, because the goal here is to have objects that are in the foreground, middle ground, and background, right? And I'm going to consider this the background, even though that's technically the background. So we've got our objects set here. You can see we've got these really nice reflections and shadows. I may actually, for the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to boost the intensity of our dome light so we get brighter lights there. So I'm going to select my dome light. Because the background is distracting, I'm going to turn that off, right? So we don't have to worry about looking at that right now. And then I am going to increase the exposure, I think, a little bit. That's a lot bit. I'm going to increase it just a tiny bit so it's a little bit brighter in our scene. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to my camera. And we're going to go to some of these other settings. So I'm going to go ahead and click on optical to start with. So under optical, I have exposure adjustment here too, right? I can increase the exposure. I can decrease the exposure just like you would do on a real camera. There are two different types. The EV, or the filmic, basically adds this ISO sensitivity. right? So the higher the sensitivity, the more light comes in. We're not going to really worry about that right now. You can adjust your white point. You can apply vignetting, right? So I can actually have the edges be darker than the center of the image. We're not going to worry about that right now. Then the other thing I can do is deal with depth of field. Now currently my depth of field, my focal distance is 2,000 centimeters away. I have no idea how far away that is, but if I check mark this bokeh box here, I can tell that it's way out of focus, right? What bokeh is bokeh are these artifacts. Whenever there's like glare in a real camera, you can see the shape of the aperture that lets light in the shape of these bokeh. And in this case, they're set to, if I open this up, it's set to circular, but I could also say like bladed, and it's going to look a little different. And there's things I could do. You'll notice it takes a long time to render this. So I'm going to turn bokeh off for the time being. But let's go ahead and adjust our focal distance. Let's say that we want this sphere right here to be in focus. And so what I'm going to do is in my viewport, I am going to click on this. I'm going to come over and I'm going to click on this one thing. And you'll note that my focal distance is now 127 centimeters, right? And so you can also choose an object, right? So I could have gone down here and selected this and chosen that specific object, but because it's a cloner, that might cause some problems because it may not see it as an individual clone or object, it may see it as the group. And so now that I've done that, let's go ahead and adjust our aperture. I'm going to set my aperture to 1. And I want you to note that things are starting, and it's kind of hard to see. Let's go ahead and do this. And then I'm going to go ahead and turn bokeh back on. And so with my aperture set to 1 and bokeh on, right, you can see that with an aperture that small, only this object and anything that's kind of aligned in that plane is going to be in focus. Everything else is very, very out of focus. So let's go ahead and set this to something a little bit nicer, like 3. Right, so now we've got a little bit more depth of field. Right, there's a bit more space that's in focus before things go wildly out of focus. All right, this is a really powerful tool. So if I set this to, if I go back to 8, you'll see that things that are really, really close or really far away are blurry. F22 is what most camera lenses go up to. There's certain cameras that are special that go higher than that. And F1.4 or 1.0 is usually the lowest aperture that you can get. So in our case, right, even at F22, these things that are really close are still blurry and things that are in the background are a little blurry. But most of the scene is in focus. So let's go ahead and make this, let's go back to F8, right? We're just going to do the default setting because it's actually kind of a nice range for what we're working on, right? So now you can see that we can pretty easily have these really nice, like amazing effects that make this feel even that much more real because, right, we usually see the photographed world through camera lenses and all the different lighting issues that occur when we look through a lens. We're not going to worry about these settings. You can play with these and see how that changes things, right? It takes a long time to render, so I'm not too worried about any of that. We're not going to worry about any of those other settings. There are some color correction things here. You can tone map. You can do some other controls in camera, which is kind of awesome. I'm not worried about those settings. The ones I am worried about are lens effects, background, and display. So if I click on lens effects, there are several things here that we can do. And this depends on light and everything else. But if I turn bloom on, if I click this override, it should bloom the image some, it looks like. Let's see here. Did that make any change at all? Let's see if I can pull this threshold up a little bit. down a little bit. Maybe I have to hit this to get it to... I had bloom working earlier. I don't know why it's mad at me now. But it is not... And maybe my render settings are set. I guess I can go ahead and turn this on in my render settings if I want. But yeah, so there's settings here. Let's see if I can figure out why this isn't working. Let's go to my render settings. And let's see here. You know what? The reason it's probably not doing anything is it probably doesn't apply it until the end. And because I'm doing all of these progressive passes, right, it's taking forever for this thing to render. So if I drop my progressive passes down significantly, let's see what happens when we get to the end of that progressive pass. And this isn't going to be a great image. I'm going to drop this even lower so we can go a little bit faster. And then I'm going to override this. And decrease my threshold. See if that makes any changes whatsoever. I'm going to have to investigate that. It was working great earlier. I don't know what I've done wrong. Okay, so maybe, do I have to set it here? Maybe if I go to advanced and go to... Okay, so I'm not sure why that's... We'll come back to that. Okay, so the other options we have here are background. If I override this, let me make sure that this is actually working like it's supposed to. Hey, look at that. Okay. Cool. Okay, so let's go back to black. So one of the other settings I want to show you is some people have already asked me about compositing and things like that. One of the things you can do in Cinema is you can, with this camera, you can select your background and you can either add an image. Note that I have this set to render settings, but it's off, but now I have override on. I can either do a color or I can do an image. So if I wanted to say, I knew I was going to say use a green screen or bring this into After Effects or something, and I wanted to be able to put this in front of something else in After Effects, I can set my background color to this color green, and then I can key that out later. Blue is also a very frequent color that's used for keying. Note that I can also set my background to be 100% transparent. And that way, this image, when I export it, if I export it in a format that supports transparency, I will just have emptiness back there, and I can composite it that way. Right? There's different types, and there's a few other settings here as well. We're not going to go super deep into because it's really a case-by-case basis on what needs to happen there. But I want you to know that you can do solid colors, and we can also drop in an image. So I've been using this Cairo photograph all the time. I can make that my background image, and you can't really see much of it because it's actually blurring. And that's because type is set to be in render. If I did this post composite instead, what that means is I can see this image clearly because, it's not being impacted. It's not as though it's actually in the scene with the rest of the objects. It's something outside of what I'm working on. Okay, so I've got that option. One of the other things I want to show you real quick is the display. So display, one thing we can do is we can turn on a focus plane. And what the focus plane is it basically is like an overlay that says, this is where our focus is, right? Everything else is going to be more or less out of focus. This can be really useful when you're trying to find, make sure certain objects along a plane are all going to be in focus. I'm not going to be worrying so much about the focus plane. There are overlays as well that we can turn on. And so we can do grids, and you'll see this is happening actually in our viewport, right? So this is rule of thirds. This allows us to align things by the rule of thirds. We can turn on multiples at the same time, but right, here's the golden section. Here's the golden spiral, right? And we can, each one of these has a drop down, so we can actually say, oh, actually I want this over here, or I want to mirror this down below. And look at that. That's actually, kind of vaguely, there's actually, I did that. That's kind of bizarre how well that's actually composed based on that rule. Maybe if I made each of these like red or something, it would actually even flow better. Yeah, so in terms of compositing and making sure your scene is aligned in a way that makes sense, with the grid, you can do thirds, right? You can do, you could go down to 2, right? So you can center things. You could go up to 4 or whatever you want that grid to be. It really just depends on how you're trying to align the objects in your scene. So there's overlays. So the background, the overlays, and the optical tags are the ones we're most focused on. For some reason, lens effects are not working for me, and I'm going to have to investigate why that is. Okay, so we can go ahead and save our scene now because we've made a physically accurate thing. Now, if you did set your progressive passes lower, you can go ahead and boost that back. 1024 is the default. This should create a much higher quality result.